How and why did slavery end in the United States? This is perhaps the most important question to answer when it comes to 19th century American history. The end of slavery was a critical turning point in the evolution of the United States, one which would alter its economy, politics, and society, and ultimately the very idea of what it means to be an American. How we answer this question of slavery's end, of who was responsible and why, shapes the way that we understand the forces that drive change in human events. Also, our answer to this question helps determine the way that we interpret what came next, how the legacy of slavery continued to affect U.S. history up to the current day. I would be willing to bet that for most Americans today, this question of slavery's end has a relatively straightforward answer. It was Abraham Lincoln. After all, Lincoln was the President of the United States during the Civil War, and of course he was responsible for the Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order issued on January 1st, 1863, declaring the freedom of all slaves in the 10 states that were still in rebellion against the Union. Although the proclamation did not in itself outlaw slavery, nor did it make the ex-slave citizens of the United States, it did in effect announce the freedom for roughly 3.1 million of the 4 million slaves in the country, without compensation to their owners. That's a pretty compelling argument for Lincoln as the cause of slavery's end. And indeed, Abraham Lincoln has come down in American legend as the great emancipator, an almost mythical figure of towering stature, who single-handedly brought the evil institution of slavery to an end with his bare hands. Like most of the well-known facts of U.S. history, though, this story of the great emancipator has elements of truth and healthy doses of mythology. Historians in general are often suspicious of this sort of great man theory of history, the idea that the most important changes in human affairs are largely the work of a very small select group of exceptional individuals. They argue that historical change is far too complex, dynamic, and unpredictable to be the work of a tiny population of usually white males, no matter how talented and powerful they might be. Aside from that, there are some specific problems with the argument that Lincoln was an activist for abolition, determined to use his authority as president to end the evil institution of slavery. For one thing, Lincoln repeatedly insisted all throughout his campaign for president that he was not an abolitionist. He did not believe that the federal government had the constitutional authority to touch slavery where it already existed. Although he personally found slavery repugnant and offensive to American values, he believed that it was protected by the Constitution. At his inaugural address, when the Southern states were in secession, Lincoln stated that he, quote, had no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. In fact, he announced his willingness at his inaugural address to support a constitutional amendment that would explicitly guarantee slavery's protection if the rebellious states would return to the Union. Lincoln's overarching objective, he reiterated years into the Civil War, was to restore the Union. So determined was he to keep the focus of the war on this aim and to ensure that this was not a war against slavery that he insisted, as Commander-in-Chief, that Union officers in the field return any fugitive slaves to their rightful owners. Lincoln was not the unambiguous great emancipator of legend. At the very least, something had changed his mind by 1863 when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. What was it? What I would like you to do is to consider the end of slavery in the United States as a very complex process, one that involved many more actors, hundreds, thousands, even millions more than just the president. That ending slavery required the work of radical Republican members of Congress like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, abolitionists who pushed an essentially moderate Lincoln toward emancipation. That a crucial role was played by Union Army officers on the front lines, the first to confront the breakdown of the Southern infrastructure and society, officers who made decisions in the field about emancipation without orders from above. And most importantly of all, I want you to consider the actions of hundreds of thousands of people who didn't wait for any officer or politician, not even the President of the United States, to grant freedom, but instead they took freedom into their own hands and with their own feet. While Lincoln, politicians, white Northerners and Southerners all debated for the reasons for this war, there was one group that knew this was a war about ending slavery, and that is the slaves themselves. Think about this small anecdote. At 11:30 p.m. on March 11, 1861, that is before fighting in the war had even begun, a fugitive slave paddled up to Fort Sumter, having heard that the federal government was preparing to free the slaves, and he sought the protection of federal troops. In fact, the federal troops guarding Fort Sumter turned him away because although they were committed to loyal service to the Union, they would not fight for the emancipation of slaves. What this story emphasizes is the activism of the slaves themselves. This example would be replicated hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands of times over the course of the war, as slaves used the conflict to take freedom and to turn this into a war about ending slavery. Is it possible that the most critical role in ending slavery was played by the least powerful members of American society? To understand how and why slavery came to an end, the context of the Civil War is critical. The American Civil War was perhaps the world's first total war. That is, a modern or industrial form of warfare that is unrestricted in terms of the weapons used, the territory or combatants involved, or the objectives pursued, especially one in which the laws of war are disregarded. That last point deserves special emphasis. In a total war, each side mobilizes nearly all human and material resources to fight the conflict. Because the war objectives are so all-consuming, the differentiation between combatants and civilians tends to vanish completely, with no discernible line between the battlefield and the home front. This form of war reached unimaginable heights in World War I and World War II, two global conflicts previewed in the American Civil War. To reiterate, the Civil War was a total war, a war defined by mobilization of all resources. Governments of both the North and the South co-opted civilian factories, railroads, banks, farms, all harnessed and directed towards the war effort. Entire economies, North and South, were marshaled and directed towards the one aim of the war. Naturally, this meant the growth of government power in northern and southern regions. Both sides enacted high taxes, created large bureaucracies, compelled men to fight through conscription, that is, the draft. This is an important fact to remember. War feeds government powers. And finally, the Civil War was a war against civilians. As this incredibly bloody conflict continued year after year, the line between combatants and civilians blurred and then vanished. The Civil War was marked by enormous violence against the home front populations, especially in the South, where the Union Army ultimately employed a scorched earth policy of destruction. These are all crucial points to consider when interpreting the course of the war, and specifically why this became a war against slavery. It is very important to understand that at the start of the Civil War, very few Northerners would have willingly fought and died if they thought that this was a war to end slavery. Most Northerners fought because they believed that Southern secessionists were traitors, rebels, and because so much animosity had built up between the North and the South over the previous decades. This is why Abraham Lincoln was emphatic that this was not to be a war waged against slavery, and why he worked to bring the South back into the Union, even if it meant a constitutional amendment protecting slavery. Lincoln knew that if he was to maintain support, this must be a white man's war. And yet, the Civil War did become a war to end slavery. So the big historical questions are how and why. And the answers lie in the cauldron of the conflict itself, in the crucible of this devastating total war, which, once begun, led to unpredictable consequences. It's safe to say that no one at the beginning of this conflict foresaw that this would be America's first total war. Nor could anyone have envisioned the sheer brutality and scale of death and destruction that modern technology would unleash. From the start, Northerners in particular believed that the war would end quickly, after a decisive battle or two. They thought this way because of the seemingly overwhelming advantages that the North had over the South in terms of manpower and industrial production. Napoleon once said, "God favors the biggest battalions," and indeed common wisdom held that the side with the largest army would win, and that side was clearly the North. Just study this chart here of comparable resources. The North could put 4 soldiers on the field for every one from the South. At the start of the war, the North had a 32-to-1 advantage in terms of firearms. It had a 10-to-1 advantage in terms of factory production. Most naval power was in the North. Most Navy admirals and ships fought for the North. A bigger Navy allowed the North to move its big armies, to keep them supplied, and to attack more locations along the coast and up the rivers. The North could blockade the South, and it did, like a great snake around its shores. This allowed the North to choke the South from outside goods and resources, and since the South did not have enough of an internal economy to survive. By nearly every measurable value, the market and industrial revolutions had prepared the North more effectively for total war. As you can see in this chart, the South maintained only one material advantage: cotton. But even this belies the fact that this was primarily an export commodity, and that the North even had a substantial advantage in textile production. Before moving on, please recognize one crucial omission on this list of resources: slaves. Next to cotton, slaves were the South's #1 economic resource, providing not only labor and capital but also manpower to keep the home front economy active during the war. This fact would become of paramount importance as the Civil War dragged on. Given this data, one would think the South did not have a chance. And yet, Southerners and most Europeans initially believed that the Confederacy would win. Why? The fact that the war would be fought primarily on Southern territory gave the South a tremendous military advantage. The South did not have to win battles. It simply had to put soldiers in the field. The South could fight a war of attrition, that is, simply play defense long enough to outlast the Northern resolve to fight. That is why Southerners consistently cited the American Revolution as a precedent. In the American War for Independence, the Continental Army under George Washington lost many battles, as well as control over major cities to the far superiorly equipped British Imperial Army. But Washington kept his army in the field and over time wore the British down. And in that war of attrition, the Americans were able to inflict high losses on the British and eventually win. In order to win the Civil War, it was recognized that the North would have to not only win battles, but also occupy the South, which meant constant expansion of material resources and manpower. Again, Southerners argued that the British had lost to the Americans in the War for Independence because they were far from home base and they could not occupy territory gained in battles. In the war's earlier years, the South also had the best and most experienced officers in the United States. A preeminent example of this was General Robert E. Lee, a military engineer, veteran of the Mexican-American War, former superintendent of West Point Academy, and second in command of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment in Texas. He was able to lead his outnumbered and undersupplied army to many victories. Finally, and this point cannot be overstressed, Southerners simply knew the battlefield better than Northerners. It was their land, it was their home turf, and the fight for one's home often generates energies that compensate for other material disadvantages. The demands of a total war gave the South's home front a more critical and enlarged importance than previously constrained wars. Think about it. With all able-bodied Southern men going off to battle, it was left to wives, to family members, and to slaves, not only to maintain the normal agrarian functions of the Southern infrastructure, but also to direct its productive energies toward the war effort. It was Southern farms and plantations, the latter driven by slave labor, which supplied food, resources, and money to Southern armies. Keep that in mind. Now, one last item related to total war concerned advances in military technology. As mentioned, the Civil War was one of the first conflicts in world history to feature mass-produced industrialized weaponry on a grand scale. This fact, perhaps more than any other, helps to explain the unexpected shock that the war produced on both sides. Relatively new weapons like the rifled cannon were fielded in battle for the first time with devastating consequences. The most important new piece of weaponry on the field was the rifled musket. The advent of the rifled musket is rightly considered a revolution in military technology, one that would turn what many believe would be a quick conflict into a long and gory war. A traditional musket is a single-shot weapon. That is, you fire it once and then you need to stop and reload. Such weapons had a range of only about 80 yards, and the bullets spun end over end, which made it easy to be blown off course. If you were being attacked by a bayonet charge, you might get off two, maybe three shots before being overwhelmed. With such short range and ability to volley only 2 shots, superior numbers of troops mattered most in battles fought with regular muskets. The newly designed rifled musket became widespread during the Civil War, completely changing the way battle was waged. In a rifled musket, the bullet shoots from a grooved barrel and spins like a football. As opposed to 80 yards, rifled muskets had a range of 400 yards. Snipers could even hit targets up to 800 or 1,000 yards away. This meant that one could get off several shots before being overcome by numbers. With the rifled musket, the South was able to inflict punishing casualties on the much larger Northern armies, altering the balance of power in the field of battle. Added to this was the development of trench warfare, which accentuated the slaughter. In less than 2 months at one point in the war, Ulysses S. Grant's Union Army suffered 65,000 casualties. Such bloodshed had never been seen before and produced huge levels of psychic trauma throughout American society. Compounding this horror was the fact that military hardware had outstripped advances in medicine and surgery. Rifled muskets fired larger caliber and slower bullets that entered the body, shattered bone, and rather than shooting through, remained lodged in the body. Those who survived the bullet frequently experienced infection of the wounds, either dying from infection or having their limbs amputated without anesthetic. Such enormous casualties had a debilitating effect on the home front, where family members struggled to keep their morale high in the face of these staggering losses. Recognizing this was a battle of willpower, the North made the political decision to bring the war to the Southern home front, and it proved a successful strategy. The Union's naval blockade caused severe shortages and inflation in the South. By the end of the war, inflation in the South was well over 100%. People could not even buy bread. Confederate money came to have less value than buttons and needles. The North adopted a scorched earth war strategy of direct destruction of Southern homes, farms, and railroads. Northern armies destroyed houses, plantations, and looted the Southern infrastructure. The Union Army became expert at destroying railroads in the South. It was in this context of the total war that one of the South's principal resources, slave labor, grew to become an element in the North's war against the whole of the Southern infrastructure and resource base. Now that we've established the context of total war, we can return to the main question we started with and ask once again, who was responsible for ending slavery in the United States? Let's start by taking a closer look at the obvious answer. Eventually, when Abraham Lincoln did issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, he did so under his authority as Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces. In other words, the Emancipation Proclamation was a military directive, an order given in furtherance of the Union's war effort. Given this fact, we should start by asking, what were Lincoln's war objectives? Throughout his campaign for president, Abraham Lincoln believed that secession was illegal and unconstitutional. As he saw it, the right to secession meant the end of Republican democratic government. If states were allowed to exit the Union whenever they disliked the will of the majority rule, then there was no such thing as democracy in the United States. For Lincoln, and the overwhelming majority of Northerners, this principle was not necessarily connected to slavery. Once Southern states moved to secede upon his election as president, Lincoln and other Republican Party leaders made it clear that the South could keep their slaves if they renounced the right to secession and rejoined the Union. Even once fighting started in earnest in 1861, Lincoln maintained his long-held position with regard to slavery, insisting that the Constitution provided no authority for ending it, and that the Confederacy was not a separate nation, which meant that federal law, including the Fugitive Slave Act, continued to apply. In a way, the United States under Lincoln had only one clear and consistent war aim: to reestablish and preserve the Union. That is, to compel the Southern states, by force, back into the United States. Ending slavery was at first emphatically not a goal of the Lincoln administration. Why not? First of all, Northerners made it abundantly clear that while they were willing to fight for the Union, they were unwilling to fight if this was a war on behalf of black people. Racism ran deep in Northern society, as it did throughout the whole United States. Northerners were eager to fight for preservation of the Union and even to damage the power of slave owners, but they were vocal in their belief that this must remain a white man's war. Second, Lincoln believed that a war against slavery was bad strategy, both militarily and politically. When the wave of secession began in 1860, several key slave states did not join the Confederacy. These were the strategic border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. In addition, the northwestern counties of Virginia that remained loyal to the Union split off in 1863 to form the new loyal state of West Virginia. These border states, where slavery was legal, all had economic, political, and social connections to both the North and the South. On the one hand, slavery had been dying out as these states, especially Delaware, were rapidly industrializing, with economies that did not depend on cotton production. On the other hand, one lucrative part of their economies was the selling of slaves to the cotton plantations in the Deep South, and significant portions of their populations in the border states deeply resented Lincoln's call to arms in response to secession. As one historian explained, the border states, seen in this map in green, held the wheat, corn, meat, and manufacturing that the cotton-bloated South lacked. They accounted for more than one-third of the white population of the South, and they controlled the great inland rivers, the Ohio, the Mississippi, the Potomac, that were the highways of the American economy. Lincoln's war strategy fixated on appeasing the border states, which he saw as strategically critical to the Union effort. Delaware was an important manufacturing state. Lincoln feared that if Maryland seceded, so too would Washington, D.C. As for Kentucky, it was very populous, mountainous, and difficult to capture and hold. Lincoln once said, "I want God on my side, but I must have Kentucky on my side." Lincoln promised the Kentucky governor that in exchange for the state's neutrality, he would do nothing to threaten, quote, the institutions or property of any state, but rather to, quote, defend them to the fullest extent which the Constitution and the laws of Congress have vested the president with the power, end quote. That meant no attacks on slavery. The big question for the North was how to keep these border states from joining the Confederacy. One key way: do not make this a war about slavery. So, if Lincoln had his way, this would not become a war to end slavery. And yet, by 1863, it had most certainly become a war to end slavery. How? As hinted earlier, there was one group that from the start believed that this was a war about slavery's end, and that's the slaves themselves. Even before hostilities began, we can see the most powerless people in American society taking matters into their own hands, beginning as a small trickle at first and then quickly turning into a flood. Slave refugees abandoned southern plantations and crossed over the battle lines into the advancing Union ranks. They came as refugees of war, with nothing but the shirts on their backs and the willingness to serve in the Northern cause. The refugee wave created a political and legal challenge for the North, for the Union Army, and for Abraham Lincoln, one that was being pressed by the actions of the slaves themselves. Eventually, hundreds of thousands of slaves escaped or were captured as the Union Army moved deeper into the South. The exigencies of total war had unleashed a situation that the North was unprepared for, causing chaos, contradictions, and conflicts of interest at multiple levels. Here's an example of the dynamism of war. On August 14, 1861, in Missouri, General John C. Fremont declared martial law. after a small-scale civil war broke out in this officially unionist state. Fremont announced on his own that all slaves of owners in the state who opposed the Union were now free. Consequently, slaves picked up and began crossing into Union lines in droves, volunteering to work and even serve as soldiers. Fremont's unilateral action set him at odds with the president over the legality of emancipation. Lincoln's policy towards refugee slaves followed from his constitutional convictions and his belief that federal law protected slave owners' property. In response to the actions like Fremont's, the president ordered military leaders in the field to do everything in their power to actually return what he saw as fugitive slaves to their owners. This proved to be a confusing and ultimately unworkable policy to actually enact, but it reflected Lincoln's great hesitancy on the issue of slavery. At the same time, Union officers, some of whom were abolitionists, tried to organize units of free black soldiers. At first, Lincoln refused to accept these units, saying he must keep this a white man's war, but as the war continued, it became clear that this policy was counterproductive. Another example from the Crucible of War. In Virginia, Union Major General Benjamin Butler was made aware of slaves who were abandoning their masters in the Confederate Army, coming over into the Union lines with offers of service. Butler was educated as an attorney, and as he saw it, Virginia was no longer under federal law because it had seceded from the Union. Thus, he denied that he was under any obligation to return fugitive slaves. Flying directly in the face of the policy and orders of the President of the United States, Butler put escaped slaves to work for the Union Army. Now here's a question for you. What term did Butler and other Union officers use for captured or escaped slaves? Illegal aliens, prisoners of war, contrabands, or freedmen? The answer is contrabands. And this is very telling, because contraband refers to property seized during war that is deemed useful to the war effort and is thus confiscated. This means that even Union officers considered slaves to be property. In some respects, their confiscation was an act of de facto freedom, and some escaped or liberated slaves were eventually paid a wage and treated well, but not always. As you might expect, Abraham Lincoln resisted this policy of confiscation and the designation of escaped slaves as contrabands. As a lawyer, he believed the term legitimized the Confederacy as a separate nation in international law, and as a politician, he feared that slaveholders in border states like Maryland would bolt from the Union and secede in order to protect their property and people from confiscation. But Lincoln, despite his great power, was not the only actor on the political stage. A crucial role in this drama was also played by Congress. A Congress that was now, following secession, full of Republicans, including anti-slavery and abolitionist leaders who wielded exceptional power. They responded to what they saw as Lincoln's moderation by passing the first Confiscation Act on August 6, 1861. The Confiscation Act provided that any property, including slaves, used with the owner's consent in aiding and abetting the insurrection against the United States was the lawful subject of seizure wherever it was found. Ultimately, in response to the Confiscation Act, Abraham Lincoln moved to veto this act of Congress. What was happening here was that within the context of total war, people were realizing that slavery was a critical component of the South's resources. At first, this was framed narrowly in terms of slaves used specifically by the Confederate Army to assist in fighting the Union. But there really was no line between civilian and military in this total war scenario. After all, who provided the labor in the South when soldiers were in the field? Who maintained the home front? Who grew the food? Furthermore, these actions demonstrate the wide circle of actors well beyond Lincoln in the drama of emancipation. Slaves took freedom for themselves. Union officers in the field created impromptu policies on the ground. Anti-slavery politicians in Congress passed laws. And all of this pushed a reluctant and cautious president towards emancipation. Consider Robert Smalls, a slave who worked as a sailor on a southern supply ship. On May 13, 1862, Smalls and a few other slaves stole the Planter, a Confederate ship, and delivered it to the Union Navy, along with its weapons and a secret Confederate code book. For the rest of the war, Smalls served as a Union scout in the Charleston area and later joined the Union Army. Smalls was not freed by Lincoln. He was not even freed by Union forces. Rather, Robert Smalls took advantage of the circumstances of total war to free himself. Such action became very common throughout the Civil War. It's a truism that war changes circumstances and alters history. Despite early optimism that this would be a quick war decided in a few battles, the Civil War dragged on longer and spilled more blood than anyone anticipated. The Union war effort went poorly at first, with thousands dying in battles and few victories. By 1862, the future seemed bleak to many, and the trauma of modern industrial warfare was having a crippling effect on the psychology of American society. Many were coming to believe that the poor war effort was due to some sin that the nation had committed, that only the wrath of God could explain the apocalyptic levels of violence. It was in the Crucible of War that many, including Lincoln, gradually grew to believe that this was, after all, a war about slavery. For others, the total war demonstrated that slavery was a key source of the South's economy, infrastructure, and war effort. And it was precisely on this basis that Lincoln found his position shifting in late 1862 toward emancipation. Even then, the president was consistent in his principle that the main objective of the war was preservation of the Union. When questioned by Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, about his intentions regarding slavery, Lincoln famously responded, quote, "I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union." Just 1 month after writing that letter, Lincoln issued his first Emancipation Proclamation, which announced that at the beginning of 1863, he would use his war powers as commander-in-chief to free all of the slaves still in rebellion once they came under Union control. Lincoln's position evolved over the course of this unpredictable and devastating war. But in the end, the Emancipation Proclamation was still a military order, a measure designed to help the North win the war by depriving the South of a critical component of its labor and resource base. Lincoln believed he had the constitutional authority to do this only because this was war. Ironically, the Southern states, by seceding from the Union, provided Lincoln with the legal justification to take an action that he believed unconstitutional in peacetime. It's also important to note that the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to states then in rebellion. It did not abolish slavery in the border states or even in the southern states then under Union control. It was a military order directed at places currently at war with the United States. And in order to effectively fulfill the directive, the Union had to capture the southern area in question. For these reasons, some have argued that the Emancipation Proclamation actually freed no one. Still, it was a strong signal that slavery was fatally wounded and collapsing. So, was Abraham Lincoln a brilliant politician? Or, as some hardcore abolitionists argued, was he a coward, unable to summon the moral will to unequivocally free the slaves? However you judge him, it's important to note that many, many more were involved in the drama of emancipation. It all began with the actions of the slaves themselves, who abandoned their owners, joined Union ranks, and by their sheer numbers forced Union government to make a decision on slavery. And that decision was taken by Army officers out in the field, and by Republican congressmen, who continually pushed a reluctant president in the direction of history. When asking the question, who ended slavery, perhaps a more accurate answer than the great emancipator is the great collaboration. The collapse of slavery certified after the fact by the Emancipation Proclamation, in many ways hastened the end of the Civil War. Depriving the South of slave labor had the intended effect of fatally gutting the Southern economy and infrastructure. At the same time, emancipation empowered the Union effort. Hundreds of thousands of runaway slaves widened the Northern manpower advantage. Every escaped slave confiscated and freed was one less worker for the South and one more for the North. The North had to occupy the South in order to keep captured parts of the South under Union control. One way it could do this was to allow former slaves to help with the occupation, allowing white soldiers to advance the front line. More dramatically, ex-slaves also served as soldiers themselves. After the Emancipation Proclamation, efforts increased to enroll former slaves and blacks into the Union Army. Some 180,000 black soldiers fought in the Army, and 24,000 served in the Navy. These are significant numbers. Consider, when Sherman marched across the South to the sea in the North's big decisive campaign, his entire army was only around 60,000 men. By the end of the war, it was increasingly difficult to recruit white soldiers for the war effort. Casualties were mounting, and many people who survived had lost limbs. Enlistment of black soldiers allowed the North to continue fighting despite falling numbers of white Northerners. Furthermore, the impact of escaped slaves on Southern morale should not be underestimated. Many white Southerners had believed in paternalism, the idea that the bond between slave and owner was love, and they expected slaves to remain loyal once the war began. Southerners were shocked to watch slaves escape and rebel at the first chance they got, and they were even more shocked to see former slaves return armed as Union soldiers. It was the war itself that provided the context for the end of slavery, a momentous event that even Abraham Lincoln was unprepared for. But the tremendous bloodshed of the world's first total war convinced the president and many others that there was perhaps a higher purpose for the conflict than humans could at first see. Lincoln's second inaugural address is striking and uncharacteristic for its religious overtones and references to divine intervention in the cause of war. And after his death, his secretaries found among his papers a manuscript in which he wrote, quote, "The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is somewhat different from the purpose of either party. In the Crucible of War," end quote. In the Crucible of War, the conflict had become what Lincoln had tried so hard to avoid, a war to end slavery. A transformed nation emerged from the Crucible of War. America before the war was decentralized politically and loosely integrated economically. To bend the resources of the country to a Union victory, Congress enacted legislation that reshaped the nation's political and economic character. Congress also established the sovereignty of the federal government and permanently increased its power. To most citizens before the war, Washington, D.C. meant the post office and little more. During the war, the federal government drafted, taxed, and judged Americans in unprecedented ways. The massive changes brought about by the war, the creation of a national government, a national economy, and a national spirit, led one historian to call the American Civil War the Second American Revolution. The war devastated the South. 3/4 of Southern white men of military age served in the Confederate Army, and half of them were wounded or killed or died of disease. The war destroyed 2/5 of the South's livestock, wrecked half of the farm machinery, and blackened dozens of cities and towns. The immediate impact of the war on the North was more paradoxical. The struggle cost the North a heavy price, 360,000 lives. But rather than devastating the land, the war set the countryside and cities in the North humming with business activity. The radical shift in power from South to North signaled a new direction in American development, the long decline of agriculture and the rise of industrial capitalism. Most revolutionary of all, the war ended slavery. Ironically, the South's war to preserve slavery destroyed it. Nearly 200,000 black men dedicated their wartime service to its eradication. Because slavery was both a labor and racial system, the institution was entangled in almost every aspect of Southern life. Slavery's uprooting inevitably meant fundamental change in the South. But the full meaning of abolition remained unclear in 1865. Determining the new economic, political, and social status of nearly 4 million ex-slaves would be the principal task of Reconstruction.